Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. I am MagMongoSlade. The Vince McMahon documentary was released September the 25th on Netflix, a 6-part documentary detailing the entire career of Vincent Kennedy McMahon from his start into the business until his unfortunate ouster in 2022. The review for this channel will not be a traditional review where I look at episode 1, 2, 3, 4. No, instead we're going to group the subjects, the topics together and do a review of a subject. Subject 1 is the McMahon family. What was in the documentary about the McMahon family? What did we learn about the McMahon family? And what was missing from the McMahon family story? Let's start with what was missing. There were missing members of Vince McMahon's family. For instance, there was no talk at all of his brother or his sister, which Vince McMahon has a brother and a sister. His brother passed away at the age of 77. I'm not so sure about his sister. But there is no conversation at all whatsoever about them. Vince McMahon also had a stepmother, who I believe her name was Juanita. That was his father's wife when he met her. There's almost no conversation about her either. There's also very little outside of the talk of abuse about his mother. There's almost very little to nothing about her as well. So there's a great deal missing in terms of how Vince relates to other family members. But what you get from the documentary in terms of how Vince's behavior and his thought process is that he seemingly keeps everybody, with the exception of one person, at arm's length. And the one person that he seems to really kind of let in is Stephanie. That seems to be the one person that he likes Stephanie. He wants Stephanie around. He brings Stephanie in. But Shane, who I think the documentary leans a lot more towards sympathetic towards Shane, telling Shane's story is important as it shows what kind of father Vince McMahon is. And to be quite honest, I think that's a good place to start. What kind of father was Vince McMahon? We know he wasn't much of a son because he never actually met his dad until he was 12 years old. And then he won't talk about his mother. We don't know what kind of brother he was because he won't talk about his brother or his sister. But there is an extensive amount of information in here about what kind of father he was. And the sense that I got from it was that they wanted to show you, and this is kind of maybe people being defensive, but I just want to throw this out there. There was a sense of Vince was manipulating the kids. That he had manipulated Stephanie into being sexy on TV, doing sexual angles and stuff like this. He had manipulated Shane into thinking that if he goes out there and throws himself onto the mat and falls from high places, that dad will love you. I kind of got that sense, and maybe nobody else would get that, but that's kind of what I got out of it. The amount of time they spent on Shane was clearly for sympathy. Episode 6, especially, was very heavy on the Shane content. He talked about Shane leaving WWE for several years after him and Vince have a falling out. There's stories in here from Paul Heyman saying that Shane and Vince would get into these arguments, and Vince gave Shane a knife and said, "Stick it right here. That's the only way you're going to get what you want." You know, just showing that Vince is like psychotic, right? Like he's really just a crazy person. And this is what Shane has to deal with. That this man is so controlling, so stuck in his ways. There's the story about UFC in here. You know, when UFC was having the financial troubles and Shane wanted to buy the company. And Vince didn't want to buy the company. And then there was a little dig that Vince threw in there when he says, Shane, use your own money. And Shane kind of, in the editing and the way it's put together is kind of like Shane was proven right in the end because UFC sold for $4 billion just a few years later. But Vince said in the documentary, he told the truth. Shane didn't have the money to turn UFC around. And it's a different business model than what from WWE was doing. I get that you want to have some sympathy for Shane and you want to show that it would have been a good business to take control of, but it's very different from pro wrestling. And Vince knows nothing about mixed martial arts. And Shane knows a little bit, I guess, but he didn't have the money. And what people need to realize, too, when you talk about this deal with UFC, is that the reason it sold for $4 billion is because of what the Fertittas put into it. And the Fertittas lost money for years and years and years on UFC before it started making any money. Did Shane have the funds by himself to get in there and do that? That would be the question I would have asked, upon bringing that subject up. But a lot of it was Vince is an old man. He wouldn't get out of the way. Shane is trying to impress his dad. So he's coming to him with business ideas or creative ideas or whatever. And at every step, Vince is in the way. He's blocking him. And then they get to the episode 6, which again is very Shane heavy. And you get a sense that Shane was living his life on his own, and then Vince called him to come to make the big return. And then we get, of course, the WrestleMania 32, and all the various wrestlers and the talking heads are discussing the relationship between Shane and Vince. And how Shane is constantly chasing the big hug. He's constantly looking for affirmation from Vince. And then you finally got it at WrestleMania 32 after he took the big bump off the cell. And Vince gave him a hug. And Shane was so emotional about that. But they also did a really good job of juxtaposing Vince's coldness to Shane's warmth. Because they showed the footage of Shane backstage with his sons, surprising them, saying, you guys are going to come out there and be in my entrance for WrestleMania. And the boys are so excited. They also showed, after Shane takes the big bump on the cell, you see Stephanie in the back like, oh my God, I hope Shane's okay. And Vince doesn't move. He's just watching the screen intently, paying no attention to his own son falling off the top of the cell. Those things resonated with me. If you pay attention, they're telling you what kind of father Vince McMahon is, at least to Shane. At least in relation to Shane. That Shane has put his body on the line for the company. He came with creative ideas. He came with business ideas. And Vince wanted nothing of it. Wanted nothing to do with it. What was it about Shane that he didn't like? Was he never proud of Shane? Or was he much like his own father? Where you get a sense that Vince himself was never really close with his dad. So he's got that old man distance where, guys today, they want to hug and kiss their sons on the forehead and all that stuff. Back then, maybe that's not what you do. Maybe you show your love and affection in a different way. Vince says in the documentary that he's always been proud of Shane, of the things that he accomplished. He says that he's always been proud of Shane for the things that Shane has tried. this was meaningful, except in some sense it does feel a little bit empty. When Vince talks about his father, and he talks about his father telling him that he loved him after he became a success. He successfully paid off the company from Vince Sr. and Gorilla and Arnold Scotland and all these guys. And now he's starting to compete on a national level. You know, he's going in there, he's mixing it up, and there's a rift between father and son. And the rift is that Vince Sr. does not approve of what Vince Jr. is doing, but he's the boss now. And so you get a sense that Vince is expecting Shane to have the same ambition. And instead of asking for permission for him to just go out and do something for himself. That's what it feels like to me. And it ties so closely to what Vince was saying about the UFC. Take your money and do it. Why'd you come to me and say, Dad, I got this idea, rather than you just go and do it? Is that what he wanted for Shane? Is he wanted Shane to take the initiative to go out and do something on his own? Because he ended up leaving eventually. And Shane had nothing to do with the company for almost 10 years. But it seems like Vince is a guy who has problems communicating that kind of thought to his son. It really made him look like a shitty father. It felt like he was a terrible father. That he was emotionally distant. That he was manipulative. That's how it felt. I don't know if that was their intention, but that's how it felt to me. At least on the subject of Shane, it seemed like he was emotionally distant. He denied Shane rewards. He, of course, denied him the company, which everybody kind of felt should have been Shane's, to run after Vince was gone. He denied a lot of Shane's ideas, rejected a lot of Shane's ideas. And he seemed to push Shane's buttons. Doing the storylines with Linda, where he's having these affairs with Linda sitting right there, knowing that Shane doesn't like it. This other little petty thing here, specifically with Shane, is that, Vince is nudging Stephanie towards dating Paul, Triple H. And Shane is against it. He's like, no, she can't date one of the boys. How is she going to date one of the boys? Of course, this becomes a storyline on TV, right? But Vince says, like, what do you mean? She can't date a wrestler. You're like, what do you think I am? He was putting himself in the position of a wrestler, saying, and there's a positive to this too. I'll get into a second. But it almost came across as if he was saying to Shane, like, who are you? Like, we're all wrestlers. You're a wrestler, I'm a wrestler, she's a wrestler. We're all wrestlers. Do you think you're better than us? And that's the sense that came to me when he said the way Shane was against Paul and Stephanie dating, that it was almost as if he was looking at Shane as if Shane were judging the boys. And he saw himself as one of the boys. That seemed to be very awkward to me. Because you are the boss. Now you're out there wrestling, but you don't need to. Shane doesn't need to do this. Stephanie doesn't need to do this stuff. And maybe Shane was, being a little uppity. Who knows? I'm pretty sure the context of those conversations is a little bit different than what we got from the documentary. But I got a sense of he felt judged by Shane, or at least was defensive about what he does and what he was sort of nudging Stephanie to do. So the Shane part really stuck out to me as being, what kind of father is this guy? Now, the Stephanie stuff made him look creepy. And that was kind of, I guess it was by design. Stephanie is not featured as much in the documentary as Shane is. In fact, outside of episode 5, there's not a lot of Stephanie at all, actually. So we get a sense that Vince saw a bit of himself in Stephanie, that she was so enamored with him that it doesn't matter what he asked her to do, she would do it. And she was also a Vince pleaser, but in a little different way than Shane. That she put herself in this position to be demeaned, for the crowd to call her a slut and a whore. And the boys are calling her a slut and a whore. I mean, that became a running gag in the Attitude Era for years and years, Stephanie being called names. Stephanie in these relationship angles. The camera angles is catching her trying to be sexy. And people are like, isn't it weird that your father is asking you to do this stuff? To make out with this guy when the camera is on your legs going up your skirt? Isn't that weird? But mostly, it felt like he was exploiting and manipulating Stephanie in terms of matchmaking her with Triple H, kind of like nudging that situation into life, making it happen. Of course, that begs the question, like, every time they tell this story, and it's not a new story, clearly. This is a story that they've been told 100 times already, but it takes on a different context when you're showing him as manipulative and in some ways distant or abusive or whatever. It could go into a ha ha ha, I like this guy. It would be, I wouldn't mind you dating my daughter, to you should probably date him. Almost like an arranged marriage of sorts. And that gives it a real weird vibe. And I really, really considered that as I was sitting and listening to the Stephanie part of the show. So there's the idea that Vince wants the wedding, the real wedding, to be on pay-per-view. Stephanie says no. So Vince then books himself in a match versus Stephanie. Of course, this is positioned as punishment. That she won't do what Vince wants her to do. So she's going to get punished by him beating her up in a match, in a storyline. I don't know how true that is. I'm not certain how that was, how that worked out. But the positioning in the documentary, again, shows that if you reject his ideas or reject his advances in some way, punishment immediately comes. You get a sense that saying no to Vince has consequences. That denying Vince something that he wants has consequences. He tells the story about the baby. What if Stephanie gets pregnant and I'm the father? Which is, a completely ridiculous, absurd story that is slipped in there that makes him look like a creep. So they're showing you all these, and look, it is weird. It's weird as hell. Why would you even pitch that idea? But again, they're trying to come up with outlandish storylines and crazy ideas, and who knows how that would have been suggested, an incest angle or whatever. None of this stuff makes sense. It's the Attitude Era, it's the Ruthless Aggression Era. None of this stuff makes sense. But they made sure that that story was told because it involves two things: sex and weirdness. All right. But they didn't, thankfully, didn't say that there was any kind of retaliation for Stephanie saying no to that storyline idea. The important bit with Stephanie actually comes in later on, episode 6. Now, Stephanie's not in this show a lot at this point. But they tell the story that as Vince starts to wind down in the 2020s, that Stephanie's role and Triple H's role, it increases on the product. You know, Triple H is helping more in creative. Stephanie is helping more in the office. And that's the setup. Triple H is going to take over creative. Stephanie's going to take over in the office. When Vince gets hammered with the first lawsuit, with the first story, Stephanie becomes the CEO. Triple H takes over creative. Then there's this tug of war going into 2022 where the board doesn't want Vince to return. Vince forcefully returns. And then Stephanie immediately quits. She resigns. And this is when I really kind of raised an eyebrow, because you get a sense from the way that they put this thing together that Vince resigned because somebody close to him suggested that he should. And then, a couple of months later, he decided, you know what? I didn't need to resign. I was given bad information. I'm going to come back. And they're saying, like, who would give Vince this bad idea to resign? Who could that be? And then the camera goes right to Stephanie. And it's like, oh, is it suspicious that when Vince returns, Stephanie leaves? And I'm just thinking, I'm like, okay, I start putting two and two together. I'm a dot connector. You're telling me that Stephanie is involved with this conspiracy to bring Vince down. Or at the very least, she does, and I think maybe even Shoemaker or somebody in the documentary says it. She doesn't want anything to do with the WWE as long as Vince McMahon is involved. And I'm, okay, that's 1 + 1 = 2. But then, in my own mind, I say, Vince is coming back in 2023. He's coming back for the sole purpose of selling the company. He's going to sell the company. And Vince is telling everybody, oh, this is evolution. This is about the growth of the company, blah, blah, blah. And I say, is this punishment? Is he selling the company because Stephanie is the one who has been advising him in this situation, this trusted advisor who was on the board and all this kind of... So you start getting all these weird conspiracy theories in my head. Like, did he plan to sell the company ever? No, he planned to die in the chair. That's what he planned to do. I mean, that's obvious. He planned to work until he didn't wake up the next day. And he was grooming Stephanie to take over. Well, now Stephanie is in the chair. And she quits as soon as he comes back. Seems to me like him selling the company out of the family was Shane can't be trusted. He doesn't have enough ambition. He doesn't have the spine. As Tony Atlas said, he's too nice. And Stephanie betrayed me. That's what it came. That's how it came to me. It came to me that Vince felt betrayed by Stephanie, so he sold the company. Now neither one of you can have it. Vindictive almost. Now this is not said, but what else could it be? That you sell the company from underneath your own daughter. You didn't need to do that, really. Why else would you do that? Unless you had a sense that Stephanie was the one behind the whole shabazzle in the first place. Or at the very least, you feel like you can't trust her. The paranoia can be a really, really terrible thing. And if somebody is feeling attacked, and this is another thing we see in Vince's, his reactions, if he feels attacked, he gets defensive, he lashes out. He was so happy to sell the company because he got his power back. Screw Shane, screw Stephanie. But he got his own thing. And everybody's focused on that element. They're focused on the element of, oh, they sold the company so that he can stay in power. I'm thinking of it now like, that's one piece. But it's also perhaps that he sold the company so that Stephanie and Shane can't have it. Because he doesn't trust them. And that also makes him look like a shitty father. That he built up this business that everybody assumed was going to go to Shane and Stephanie, and they split the positions and all this kind of stuff with Triple H and everything. But no, Shane doesn't get to work in the office at all. And has not worked in WWE since Vince left, by the way. And Stephanie is out of the company. She only appears as sort of a symbol. And Triple H kind of is a little worker bee who does his little creative, and that's it. When all these people, 10 years ago, it looked like they were going to be running the company when Vince conks out. And it didn't happen. So we get a sense that he wasn't much of a son, considering he never really met his father, and we don't have any conversation about his relationship with his mom. And the only thing we know about his childhood is that he was abused by a stepfather. We don't know how he is as a brother. We don't really get a good sense that he was a good dad. Not a great one. Maybe he was good, but maybe not great. Not dad of the year, that's for sure. When you work, a workaholic as much as Vince is, family, the kids, they kind of, especially as they get older, they kind of fall by the wayside. This brings us to Linda. How was he as a husband? And you see that him and Linda were close, at least at first. They started the company together. They went through the muck and the mire together. Linda was the business, end of the company. Vince was the creative end. Linda was going to talk to state athletic commissions to get wrestling, to get WWF deregulated in the state. She was handling a lot of the merchandise and stuff like this. Vince was on screen. He was working with the boys. Everything seems to be working out great. And they never discuss when any kind of schism between the two of them happened. But it's clear that something happened. They did mention the Playboy article from 2001 where Vince talked about having affairs. There is Vince talking about Rita Chatterton, where he mentioned, and we'll talk about that in a different video, but he says that it was a consensual affair. There's at least one other woman who I believe was a secretary during the steroid trial that Vince was apparently having sex with too. And so that Linda was in the documentary. And of course they talked about her not really being good as an on-screen character, and that's nice and everything, and how to come up into the storyline, but there was no conversation from Linda's perspective of how she felt about these affairs. Assuming the affairs are consensual, of course. And these are just the affairs that we knew about. Because he's saying Rita Chatterton is just an affair. What did Linda think about that? The documentarians didn't ask. What did Linda think about the Playboy article? They didn't ask. So you just get a sense that they've been living two separate lives for a really long time. And that part is true. And we got no background on it. They had been together for 60 some odd years. And there was no conversation whatsoever about why they seemingly live two different lives. There's not even a conversation about Linda running for office. That's not even in the documentary. Vince spent almost $100 million on that thing. And there was no conversation about it at all. Or its effect on the business. Or its effect on Vince. Or its effect on their relationship. All of which is important. Because part of the reason why Linda didn't win, on top of she's not very charismatic, and certainly not charismatic enough to be a politician, is because every single commercial was about how sleazy the WWF was, how terrible Vince McMahon is, the Ring Boy scandal, all the things that they talked about in these documentaries and everything. Connecticut was inundated with that stuff when Linda ran for office. There was no conversation about how Vince felt about Linda running for office. It was so skeletal. It took a while to get to their relationship, which I was glad to see. His mother introduced them. He was 16, she was 13. And then they got married when Linda turned 17, which means he would have been about 20. But other than that, and their rough days at the beginning, there's not much talk of that either. But they talk a little bit about how they built the business together. How they came up with the first WrestleMania because Linda forced him to go on vacation. And it seemed like a normal couple. And then, skirt, there's almost no more Linda. Anything after 2000, after they talked about her as an on-screen character, there's no more Linda. There's no Linda's thoughts on the IPO and them going public. There's no Linda's thoughts on various other issues that occur in WWE that might involve Vince. No conversation at all about that. None. So, you don't really get within the family. You don't get how Vince felt about the children being born. Usually they even throw in the greatest day of my life is when my son was born. This is the greatest day of my life outside of the birth of my daughter. You don't even get anything like that in this documentary. There's no platitudes. It's drenched in emotion when it comes from Vince and Shane. The documentary is drenched in emotion. It's weird, creepy, and conspiratorial when it comes to Stephanie. When it comes to Linda, it's very little. There's no love. There's no happiness. There's no talk of their honeymoon. Nothing. There's none of that. No wedding pictures. Nothing. There might have been a wedding picture, actually. Maybe one. It seems like he's so distant from the rest of his family. He was distant from his father. He's distant from his children. He's distant from his wife. So, when you get to what the question that they're asking in the documentary of who is Vince McMahon, the family doesn't even know. How could they? So I thought this was a very interesting angle, the family angle. But what do you guys think about Vince in relationship to his family? Let me know in the comment section below, and I will talk to you guys later.